couple of words about the program that we have. We just completed a conference in Puerto Rico about empresarismo social y reconstrucción, which is the topic of the day down there in Puerto Rico. Was very successful. That's the 14th conference that we do around the recovery, the Rebuild Puerto Rico, in general, the economic crisis, and now with the post-Maria hurricane. We have a few new reports that I encourage you to look for them on the web. I'm not sure if we have copies of them here tonight, but we just put a report on housing last June, the housing crisis in Puerto Rico. We just put another report on federal policy for Puerto Rico that came out last week in conjunction with the conference. The theme was federal policy impact on Puerto Rico moving forward in the reconstruction. And we also put a 1 year after report on Maria, on post-Maria Puerto Rico. And all those are available for you on our website. So I encourage you to go there. We also have, I believe we have copies of our program for the remainder of the semester. So I welcome you. I hope that you have an opportunity to visit our library and archives and to get to know more what we do, our programs, etc. Now, it is my pleasure, as I said, to introduce Vanessa Perez-Rosario, who is an associate professor of modern languages and literatures at Brooklyn College, City University of New York. She is also an affiliated faculty in the Department of Latin American, Iberian, and Latino Cultures at the Centro. Her research and teaching interests include Latinx literature, transnational feminism, bilingualism, and translation. She is the author of Becoming Julio de Burgos, The Making of a Puerto Rican Icon. And you can see a whole panel around that topic in our website. We record all this and then we put it in the repository. She's also the editor of Hispanic Caribbean Literature of Migration, Narrative of Displacements, and I believe we have another panel around with the authors in that panel. So you can see we're a big fan of her work. Her translation of Mayra Santos Febre's collection of poetry, Boat People, is forthcoming in 2019 with Cardboard House Press. She is at work on a new book project, Other Humanities, Latinx Literature and Human Rights. So it's my pleasure to welcome you all and welcome Vanessa to lead this panel. Thank you.
Dr. Virginia Sanchez-Korrol is Professor Emerita in the Department of Puerto Rican and Latino Studies at Brooklyn College, CUNY, a historian and writer. Her first book, From Colonia to Community, The History of Puerto Ricans in New York City, 1918 to 1948, broke new ground in the study of Boricua diasporic communities. Her latest book for teens, The Season of Rebels and Roses, which we're going to hear from today, returns to the 19th century roots of that community through the genre of the historical novel. Among her many publications are the acclaimed 3-volume encyclopedia, Latinas in the United States, a historical encyclopedia, and Latina Legacies, Identity, Biography, and Community, both co-edited with Dr. Vicky Ruiz. These stand out as milestones in her career. Recent books include Feminist and Abolitionist, the story of Emilia Casanova, a pan-Antillean saga of the 10 Years' War, and her first children's book, A Surprise for Teresita, Una Sorpresa para Teresita. Dr. Sanchez-Korrol consults with the National Research and Cultural Institution, with a number of national research and cultural institutions on Puerto Rican studies and various exhibitions. She sits on the Women's History Scholarly Board of the New York Historical Society. She works with the Tenement Museum and with the Center for Puerto Rican Studies Cultural Ambassadors Project. In 2018, she was honored with a Lifetime Achievement Award from the National Puerto Rican Day Parade.
Wow. My claim to fame.
Yes.
I'm going to go first. I'm first.
Yes. We're going to start with Virginia's because the novel is set in the late 19th century, and our second panelist is her novel, Eleanor Parker Sapia. Her novel is set in the early 20th century, so it kind of makes sense to do it historically, chronologically.
Thank you, Vanessa.
So one of the things I found out when I read Eleanor's book was that her book begins at the beginning of the 20th century in Puerto Rico, and my book ends in 1899, right after the Spanish-American War, when Puerto Rico becomes a colony of the United States. And in comparing the two books, I was just fascinated by the particular themes that she picked up on that were similar to mine, and the characterization of the women in our books were really also amazing to me. I have two women in my book. That one you know all about was Lola Rodriguez de Tio. But the woman that you're meeting for the first time in my novel is Inocencia Martinez Figueroa. So I'm going to talk a little bit about her. And then I want to show you a few slides that have to do with the type of research that I do in order to put together the novel. The season of Rebels and Roses is a season. The season when Puerto Rican men and women were living in New York City and other parts of the United States and fighting for the liberation of Puerto Rico from U.S. bases. The season is also a time in the life of Inocencia Martinez Figueroa where she goes from a very spoiled, self-centered young woman, and 10 years later, she becomes the confident feminist and activist that we know. The book is based on history, and what I have done with the story is that I have tried to make it accessible to young adults. That would be mostly high school and college students. In order to take the history that we prize so much and make it into a story that will bring them to the table and will ask the questions, well, what happened? What happened next? One of the greatest comments that I've gotten since the book came out was from a colleague of mine, a historian, who read the book and wrote to me and said, the story, I love the story's fine, I love the pace, is a good pace, but you don't tell enough. What happened? What happened to her? What happened to her husband? What is she doing? What is she doing? When did they leave New York? And I called her up and I said, those questions are exactly the questions that I want to hear. Because if you were my student right now and you were asking me those questions, I would take you by the hand and I would guide you to the library and I would show you where those history books are, where you're going to get the story of what happened next. I want to tell you a little bit about Inocencia, so I'll start by introducing her, and I'm going to limit the number of readings that I'm going to do, because I want to really spend time on the slide. This is how I introduce her in the novel. She was 18 when she attended her first public lecture. The topic was 1868 Lares revolt for independence from Spain, and one fiery speaker in particular caught her complete attention. His words boomed with a passion for justice that inspired the impressionable girl. Her pulse began to race so fast she found it difficult to remain still, not to jump up to her feet and voice her approval. The charismatic speaker was the mulatto journalist Otero Figueroa. His rousing calls for freedom from colonial repression, for an independent Puerto Rico, enthralled the audience. Inocencia's mind soared, taking intellectual leaps she'd never known before. She was excited to join in the movement, to bring about the liberation he spoke of. All of those things she wanted with an urgency that she didn't quite understand. And she wanted this man too, in ways that she hadn't expected. For a second she thought of her family. Like others in Ponce's white society, They believed that even a hint of African blood polluted family trees. But I'll get around that. That's when she realized she'd crossed a forbidden social boundary. I'm destined for an exciting, challenging future, she promised herself, jutting her square chin forward in mock defiance. Shortly thereafter, Inocencia joined Doña Lola's women's group. An educated mother knows enough to educate her children, Lola would say, going against the grain of popular belief that women would use book learning to write love letters to their lovers instead of improving their minds. Like Inocencia, the others in the group were the daughters of small landowners or bureaucrats. Each one yearned to expand her own horizon. They spoke of women's rights, read essays, some written by Doña Lola herself, and devised strategies for social change. They signed petitions and joined protests. That's how Inocencia began to believe in women's rights and freeing her people and crossing society's color line. So now you know who Inocencia is, and the season will follow her growth and maturity as a young woman, as a married woman, as a mother, as a revolutionary, as an activist. Her life is full of tragedy, it's full of joy, and in the final analysis, the greatest tragedy of all happens in 1898, when the United States takes Puerto Rico as a colony, and all her work is for nothing. I had a hard time doing that part because we know about the men, we know what they did. We know about Betances, we know about Sotero Figueroa, we know about the men. We know everything that they did. There are written records, there are letters, there are minutes kept of all of their doings. We know when they create the Puerto Rico section of the Cuban Revolutionary Party. We know when they decide to invade Puerto Rico. We have all of that in our archives. What we do not have is how did the women feel? And so I want to let you have an idea of my interpretation of how she must have felt at that point in time. She and Lola have gone for a walk in Central Park, and she has her little boy with her. She's holding on to his hand because he's a rambunctious 5-year-old, and she can't let him escape to go into the sheep meadows and play with the animals. She's a very protective mother, and she has to answer Lola's question, and she answers by saying, "The truth? You want to know how I feel?" Inocencia's face fell into the deepest anguish. She stopped in her tracks to compose herself, and then she faced Doña Lola. "Empty. I feel empty. I have a huge hollow space right here." Letting go of her son's arm, she made a circle with her hand around her midsection. "And angry. And sad. Lola, I'm so sad. I could cry and never stop. How can anyone feel anything else?" I want to go through some of the pictures of who they really were, what they really looked like. That is Inocencia Figueroa. Her full name was Inocencia Martinez Santaella, and she married Sotero Figueroa, so her name is Figueroa. And she, and that's probably the only picture that we have of her. And fewer, we have.
You can pull the mic.
We have. She did very, very little writing in her life.
Pull it over here.
So we have.
There you go.
Very, very few letters. In her later life, she wrote some poetry, but I didn't look at those because my book ends in 1899. This woman is one of her mentors. In New York City, the first thing that she does is that she meets with Emilia Casanova de Villaverde, who was an activist and organized the first women's group in the 10 Years' War. You have to understand that the War of 1895 begins with Lares and Yara in 1868. It takes 30 years of that war before we finally come to the conclusion. Emilia Casanova de Villaverde's portrait actually is found in the Museum of Cárdenas in Cuba, which was her hometown. And this is Lola Rodriguez de Tio at the time of this of the story. Lola is an older woman. She has been through the Lares struggle. She has written La Borinqueña, which is well known for writing the radical words, the revolutionary words to the song. And Lola takes on Inocencia as if she were her own daughter. You have to understand the context into which these people came. It was very, very different from Puerto Rico. First, they're coming because of the revolution. They're coming to work with, Sotero's going to work with Patria. He's going to be the editor of Patria. He's going to work side by side with Martí in a relationship that is as close as any relationship you can imagine. And this is a world of newspapers. New York City is a world of newspapers where newspapers vie with one another to get the attention of the buyers. And on any given day during the time of Inocencia and Lola's residing in New York, you would find the street corners filled with the newsies selling newspapers and yelling out what the news of the day was. A very, very high energy, very competitive, very, very exciting way of life. Nothing compared to what they left behind in Puerto Rico. And this gives you an idea of the world that they had entered in order to acclimate themselves to a world of darkness and gloom, where the sun sometimes shines, nothing like what they left in Puerto Rico. And so the rupture, the exile was doubly important to them because it was a whole new world. And they spoke in English. So Inocencia has to figure out how she's going to deal with that. The Bellevue Hospital ambulance, to give you an example of what health was like during those days. But this is the hospital that Dr. Henna was attached to. And Dr. Henna was, of course, the head of the Puerto Rico section of the Cuban Revolutionary Party. He trained there and he came back to work there. This is a wealthy area of Manhattan. That's Fifth Avenue right there. And across from it is what Bonocio Tio in my book calls the Big Pyramid. It was the Croton Reservoir right across, where today the public library is on Fifth Avenue between 42nd Street and 40th Street. One of the things that I found fascinating is when you begin to do the research, and this is part of the research to teach new audiences, when you begin to do the research and you start to read something, you have no idea where it's going to lead you. I was doing a lot of reading on the type of houses that people were living in during this time, because there are very wealthy people among the Puerto Ricans that I'm talking about, and they lived in very, very fancy houses. And then there was Sotero Figueroa and Inocencia, who lived in a row house between 2nd and 3rd Avenue with the elevated railroads on each of those avenues, spewing smoke and dirt and all kinds of noise. When I came across this picture and I was reading about the houses, I suddenly came upon the story of another doctor from Bellevue, and I found out that the block that Dr. Henna lived on was a block where a lot of the doctors from Bellevue Hospital lived. And all of a sudden I realized, well, I know exactly where that house is. You see, if you walk past the pyramid and you take a right, you would be on 40th Street, close to Fifth Avenue, and that's where number 8 40th Street was. And this became very, very significant for me because I was able to really talk about the different class system and how they all work together in common cause. And to give you another view of what the dress was like, what transportation was like, what the pyramid looked like, and people used to go for Sunday walks, along the edge of the pyramid. So this is what I wanted to bring to your attention. So.
Thank you so much. I think we'll hear from both of our panelists before we take questions. So our second panelist tonight is Eleanor Parker Sapia. She is a proud Boricua born in Santurce, Puerto Rico. An Army brat, she was raised in the U.S., in Europe, and lived in Ponce, Puerto Rico several times during her childhood. I didn't write that. She's claiming herself as an Army brat.
Right.
I
thought that was great.
It has to do with
It
who
is,
you are.
yes. She's traced her maternal family in and around Ponce to the late 1600s, which she loves. She raised her 2 wonderful children in 3 European countries, now adults and out of her nest. They share her love of travel and world history. She's the author of a multi-award-winning novel, A Decent Woman, which we're going to hear about today, set in the turn of the century Ponce, Puerto Rico, published by Scarlet River Press. Her debut novel was awarded an honorable mention for Best Historical Fiction in English at the 2016 International Latino Book Awards with Latino Literacy Now. Eleanor was fortunate enough as a debut novelist to compete with Isabel Allende and her fabulous novel, The Japanese Lover, that year. She doesn't need to tell you who won the award that year. A Decent Woman, but it was a serious competition. A Decent Woman also garnered second place for Best Latino-focused fiction book in English at the 2017 International Latino Book Awards and was selected as a Book of the Month by Las Comadres and Friends National Latino Book Club in 2015. Eleanor is featured in the anthology Latina Authors and Their Muses, edited by her great friend and fellow Puerto Rican author Mayra Calvani. She's hopeful to see her novel published in Spanish. A writer, artist, poet, and alternative medicine practitioner, Eleanor worked as a counselor and as a Spanish language refugee caseworker in Brussels, Belgium, and as a Spanish language family support worker with immigrant families in Northern Virginia. In 2011, Eleanor moved from Northern Virginia to Berkeley County, West Virginia, where she writes full-time. She's currently working on her second historical novel, The Laments, set in San Juan and Isla de Cabras, Puerto Rico in 1926.
Thank you. I would be more comfortable sitting here.
Well, why'd you
You can
sit?
stay
have to.
if you want. Yeah. Wherever you're most
Good.
comfortable.
This is better.
Yeah, no, this is. I did that because of the slides.
No, that's okay. Hello. Thank you for coming out on this very, very difficult night. I'm happy to see you, and it's
Just move
not
it a little
on.
closer.
Oh,
I think
okay.
it's on.
Is it?
It is on.
Yeah, I think it's on just a
Yeah.
little closer.
Yeah. This is hard for a full-time writer who also happens to be a hermit to come out and speak in public. So if I, lose my train of thought, please bear with me. I'm happy to be here, and I'm very grateful and honored to have received the invitation from Centro, Puerto Rico and Hunter College for hosting us tonight. And thank you, Vanessa. And I'm happy to meet you as well. It's funny how when you reach a certain age, you realize that your life has been, you've hit all these milestones, and they may be random, they may seem random, and you're not quite sure, why was I here, why was I there, why did I do this particular thing, why did I meet these particular people. And when I reached 60 this year, it all came together. And I realized I know why, because that's why I write what I write and why I choose the characters that I choose. So Puerto Rico to me, it's my love, first of all. I wrote this first novel in 2000, and it was a tribute to my grandmother for her 90th birthday. I'd been an artist, an exhibiting painter for 30 years before I even considered writing a novel. So I don't have the experience, and I thought, if I can exhibit my work, I don't know how, like a child, I thought, of course I can write a novel. Why not, right? So I did. But it was a tribute to my grandmother. It was never meant to be published. Never was. So I sent it to her and all my female relatives and my mothers and my sister. And my then husband said to me, you know, you were a kid who always listened to your grandmother, because I was always a kid at her knee, like, otro cuento. Not that I didn't want to go to sleep, but I could not get enough of her stories, of her childhood, of her young married life, and the life that she lived, and the friends that she had. And one story in particular always got my attention. For some reason, even as a child, I loved her midwife, who was Doña Ana. So she's a real woman, but no one knew anything about her. No one knew where she was from. They thought she was an Afro-Caribbean woman, but no one knew exactly what island she was from. She spoke with an accent. No one knew, and no one thought to ask her. And I thought, how can that possibly be? This woman birthed my mother, my aunt, my uncle, my aunt's children as well, but no one knew anything about her. So I knew two things about Doña Ana, who's the protagonist of my novel. She drank a shot of rum and smoked a cigar after every birth. After every birth. And she did not like the smell of blood, which is tough when you're a midwife because it's kind of a messy business. That's all they knew. And they knew that she'd never married. So after I wrote the first manuscript in about 2005. I separated. I had a marital separation, so my life went completely in a different direction. I moved back to the United States after many years, and now as a single mom with kids in university, I went back to school, I went back to work, and the manuscript sat in a box for almost 9 years until I was ready. And then one day I thought, I've always been creative and I'm serving others, which I love, but I've raised my kids. I've been really socially aware and active, but I was missing something and I needed to get the story out. So that's when I moved from the DC area. I bought a house in West Virginia. I'd never been to West Virginia in my life, and I changed my life. So I fell off a cliff and I trusted that was what I was supposed to be doing, and I'm still there. On the morning of the Feast of the Most Precious Blood, Seraphina's waters discharged and labor pains commenced. I'm not going to read a birth, so don't panic. Ana Belén hurried down the dirt road as ominous storm clouds rolled in from the east, threatening to obscure the last of a hazy sunset. The only sound on the deserted street, save for the bleating of a goat in the distance, was the rush of the ocean. When the winds picked up and the first ta-ta-ta sounded off zinc roofs, Anna was nauseated, all parts of the familiar heaviness she now experienced before every storm. She lowered her head as the first raindrops dotted the dusty road ahead and noticed cool rain droplets glistening on her ebony skin. Pulling her heavy linen skirt up to her knees to avoid the splatter of mud, Anna picked up her pace. Inside the black leather satchel, the steel instruments jingled with every step. Heavier raindrops pelted the dirt street and bounced before settling into the warm, wet earth. That's the way it always was. The rain formed narrow streams in the parched riverbeds that created fast-flowing creeks. A few days later, the water would find its way back to the sea or dry up. What a waste of energy, thought Anna. In a few days, the streets of La Playa would run to dry, cracked earth. When the wind switched direction, a palm frond flew by inches from her face, and rain soon followed the wind. The acrid smell of burning sugarcane reached her nose, always a reminder of her childhood as a slave in Cuba. A black dog with white markings around the eyes barked, startling Anna as she approached the small white clapboard house of her client. As was a custom with her before a birth, Anna removed a small knife with a 1-inch blade from her pocket. She placed it under the house to keep away the evil spirits and to hopefully cut the length of labor for her client. So this is Anna coming into where she meets Serafina. Now, Anna, because of her childhood in Cuba, is her parents were both from the Yoruba tribe, so she has all of the traditions and the customs and the language and the superstition, if you want to call it that. But to her, it's her religion. So she is always worried about the spirits in the spirit world. So her world is very rich and symbolic. Like this passage here, Anna remained vigilant at the open window for the Agun, the spirits of the dead. The old Babaloa, the village priest whose wrinkled and gnarled body resembled the roots of the ancient ceiba tree, had told the Pataki, the sacred story of evil spirit soldiers hidden in the waves and in the wind. The thick, uneven scars on Anna's shoulder ached, as they often did during the rainy season, a somber reminder of him. And him is later. Her chest tightened as she prayed that the spirit soldiers who were determined to collect more souls in service of the warrior goddess Oja would not come collecting her debt. Anna had never imagined a new path would open for her the moment El Mulato took his last breath. The last time she'd seen him was on a night of rough seas and despair. Oja, ten piedad, Anna whispered, asking the goddess for mercy. She straightened her back as a lightning bolt cracked over the harbor. Reaching deep into the pocket of her floor-length linen skirt, she pulled out a rosary, a gift wrought by her mother's hands, a rosary made of the deadliest of all seeds, the red precatory. During their days of slavery, Anna's mother had told her the precatory bead rosary served many functions: prayer, suicide, and murder, as mashing one tiny bead could kill quickly if ingested. Anna closed her eyes, making the sign of the cross with the silver crucifix at the end of the rosary. And in a low voice she recited prayers the priests had taught her. Every now and then, though, she kept an open eye watchful for the Agun. The spirit soldiers were known to possess great stealth. She breathed in the dust of her ancestors and felt fear and restlessness in her heart.
Thank you. So, as you can see, we have two very compelling novels that I think describe two different worlds: late 19th century, early 20th century Puerto Rico, late 19th century. The season of Rebels and Roses moves around a little bit. So we have a description of Puerto Rico in late 19th century, then Puerto Ricans and Cubans together in New York, and a little bit of the novel also takes place in Cuba. So I wonder, I'll ask the one question and then we'll open it up, but I wonder if you could talk a little bit about, both of you could talk a little bit about the archives that you consulted and the kind of research that you did to go in, that goes into these novels. I mean, it also happens to be a historical time period that I researched, so I know that they are really quite descriptive of these worlds that, and quite accurate in describing what we know of these worlds. In the season of Rebels and Roses, it's based on two historical figures. A Decent Woman is also based on two women, but not women who are known. So I wonder if you could talk about that a little bit.
You know, I've been thinking about that quite a bit, because in terms of writing to reach new audiences and the type of research that I find that I've always done, but I didn't realize that I was doing it. And probably it has a lot to do with my own childhood, being born in New York, raised in New York, where Puerto Rico was the place we went to to be with the family at vacation time. But basically, I find that I've been trying to carve out the chapters of Boricua history, and to do that, I want to claim geography. I want to claim the houses where we lived by the numbers of the houses. I want to claim the areas. I want you to know that we were in Cuba, that we were in Boston, that we were that our diaspora was wide and larger than imagined. I tried to bring to the novel the specificity of geography and place and time, and sometimes I'll spend a lot of time researching this in order to try to figure out, okay, well, where was Doña Lola's house? Oh, not far from Columbia University. Well, who was at Columbia University during this time? You have a number of Latino, Hispanic luminaries there. She is a writer, a poet, an intellectual. She has a huge education in her own right. And so I start to put together these things where, by describing Lola and where she lives, I'm also telling my audience, claim this belongs to us. And so that's one of the reasons why I've become so sometimes too detailed. But but in terms of the way that the book is this is based on history. So a lot of it is already there before I begin to write the novel. I know Betances is in Paris. He exiles himself in Paris. He's still the titular head of the movement from Paris. I know that we have Puerto Rican leaders throughout Latin America. I know they're in Boston. I know they're in Philadelphia. I know that they're in the South. I know they're in Florida. I also know that the world at this time is a pan-Antillian world, where people are working together in common cause. And so for that reason, the book will go from Puerto Rico, based on my knowledge of Puerto Rico and my being there, to Cuba, where Doña Lola has to go in exile, to Havana, particularly, to some of the other places, Brooklyn, to the city of Brooklyn, because Brooklyn is not a borough at this time, it's a city in of itself, where I describe what happened on the night that the USS Maine was exploded. And so then I have to think, okay, now I'm in Brooklyn. I know Brooklyn, I grew up there. I know the Bronx, I grew up there. I tried thinking of the streets, of how they are, of how they're organized. With Brooklyn and the explosion of the Maine, I suddenly realized that all the families that lived in that area, the Navy Yard, Vinegar Hill, with all of these Brooklyn working class communities, they all had something to do with that ship. They either knew someone who was on the ship or somebody worked on the ship. And so try to give it that perspective, which is more human than than I usually do as a historian. But it's thank you for asking that. I've been thinking about that for a while.
Yeah.
You know. So.
Well, my research started with interviews with family and friends and my oldest female relatives, and I asked about their day-to-day life. How did you make coffee? How did you cook? Where did you cook? What was their soap? What was your detergent? How did you make starch? I mean, the basic things I wanted to know, because that's what makes historical fiction, if done seamlessly, which is nice when it happens that way, that you need to know these details. You shouldn't, in my opinion, say a palm tree. I wanted to know what kind of palm tree. Was that palm tree in Puerto Rico in 1900, 1910? Was to know the flora and fauna. So I have books on flora and fauna, the culture, Cuba, Santeria. I have about the, I read governor reports, Department of Public Health reports from that time to know about midwifery in the 1900s and the doctors coming into the birthing room for the first time. So I needed to know these things. So just to write a simple sentence, and I'm still experiencing with my work in progress, which is 1926 Puerto Rico, I write and research simultaneously, because I'll write one sentence and it'll just stop me. So sometimes I'm in the mood to research, sometimes I'm in the mood to write, but most often I can sort of cut off and be able to do a little bit of research just to get that right. I went to archives. Yesterday I received a beautiful book, so I'm always, my library at home of Puerto Rico, of culture, of language, of music, is very rich, because it needs to be. Because if I don't know that, it's just not going to come across to my reader, and I want them to have a full, rich experience. I'm trying to think of what else. Oh, I even look at drone videos, believe it or not. I'm writing of Isla de Cabras, where we had, which I did not know 2 years ago, our leper colony on Isla de Cabras. A working leper colony. And as soon as I heard that was it. That was my setting. So I have Old San Juan in my second book. So that's more fresh, because I'm doing that right now. So I'm doing the same thing, reading reports and dissertations. I read dissertations all the time. All the time.
Yeah.
And any kind of archive I can get my hands on. And that's important, to look at the art and to look at everything. And I travel to Puerto Rico every year. So this past summer I went to Isla de Cabras. My sister and I walked, and I had to smell it. I wanted to see it. I wanted to see the coastline. I wanted to look at the grass. I wanted to see how far I was from La Perla, where my protagonist is from. She's a novice nun who's trying to figure out whether she should give her life to God or not. But she's from La Perla, where she was born. So I like this looking back and looking forward. So I've stood at El Morro and looked at Isla de Cabras, and from Isla de Cabras looking back, because I'm an artist, it has to be visual, and I have to see it. I have to hear the dialogue. So sniff that out. It's not going to be believable, so it needs to be believable to me. And the research is ongoing, because I hope that all my books will be set in Puerto Rico.
One of the most exciting moments when I was reading Eleanor's book was to find out how you made starch. I said, wow, look at what you had to go through in order to make starch, in order to iron something.
Exactly.
And that was great.
And to dry your clothes under
Yeah.
the moon, the full moon, because it would
Instead of
make
the
it
sun.
whiter.
Yeah.
Now that actually was
Right.
told to me by my mother's dearest friend,
Yeah.
who grew up in Vega Baja, actually.
Yeah. I like that. Yeah.
Thank you.
I see some hands already in the audience, so we'll start with Edwin.
Well, thank you.
Questions?
Using privilege here. But I actually want to ask Vanessa a question, and then I'd like the two of them to respond. It's very intentional, because I know this is enough material to have a journal paper.
Yeah.
That will be submitted to Centro. Vanessa is.
He's now
So
enlisted
There
me
you go.
to write an
You're
article.
done.
So well, it's almost written. Really, if you were to interpret the intention of the authors here and how they develop this feminine voice in this context where it's really not well understood, and it's really, our feminism doesn't have a history, so to speak, and how they use fiction to create that voice and explore, those tensions both in the revolutionary movement and then the post-colonial era. So how would you interpret the intentions of these authors, and how will you find the commonalities in this theme? I don't know if I'm mistaken the theme, and then I want the author to respond to that intention, because she could be mistaken, and I want this paper to be great.
Yeah, I mean, definitely the theme of feminism is, I mean, there is no question that it was clear as I was reading both novels. Of course, with this season of Rebels and Roses, it gives us Virginia gives us a sense of the role of women, how active women were in the revolutionary movement and what their roles were. And of course, I'm really wondering about this scrapbook. Is this scrapbook around, or is this yes, you just imagined her saving all of these things that didn't make it into an archive.
The reason the scrapbook came up is first because it's historical in the story, but also because when the women did not attend, the women were not part of the men's organizations.
Right.
There were a few organizations that were male, female, but when Hannah closes the books on the Puerto Rico section, he saves everything. He puts it in a lockbox because it's going to be part of the history. He saves everything, and it's available. It's online. It's available. His letters, the minutes of the meetings. Every meeting had las actas. Inocencia's Women's Club, which is the first one, and lasted it begins in 1892 up until 1898. There are 3 minutes that appear in the archives when you do research on them, and the importance of that for us is monumental. And had we the women's with Emilia Casanova de Villaverde, we have a number of the minutes of her clubs. She creates the first club for the 10 Years' War. So that's where the scrapbook comes, because you have to have a scrapbook, otherwise you have to write, you have to leave something, you have to, whether it's oral history, whether it's telling, or whether it's writing, you've got to leave something, otherwise your existence is erased. So
I mean, that
Yeah.
idea of leaving something is
Yeah.
in both novels,
Right.
because there's the scrapbook and there's Anna's ledger that she
Right.
doesn't always fill out as carefully as her mentor did, but it's there.
She's illiterate.
Right. Yeah.
So she can write. She writes the names, and often has her clients write their names, the name of the day of the birth. But she's almost like an accidental feminist, because she's came from Cuba, middle of the night on a ship. She was smuggled out of Cuba because of a situation that happened. So she arrives with not knowing anyone, and meets her mentor, who's a midwife. So she's taught by her, and I think most of the women in my novel were accidental. They didn't have that idea of fighting, but they knew that they had to survive. And
accidental feminists.
Well, I mean in that they didn't know the word. They just knew that they were writing, saving their lives, or just doing the best they could.
Mm-hmm. And I think another thing that's interesting in A Decent Woman is that it's a time period, an early period where you have a changing society with the arrival of kind of imposition of U.S. laws and customs, and so the suppression or the turning away from midwifery to medical doctors.
Right. Hospitals were being built.
Medical doctors who are all men.
Right.
So there's that change that's happening where in some ways it seems like there was a little more freedom for some of these women in an earlier period,
before.
that early part
Exactly.
of the 20th century. There's that. But one of the things that I thought of as I was reading both of them is, the question of why a novel as opposed to, Virginia's a great historian. Why not a history book on or a social biography of Inocencia and Lola Rodriguez de Tio? And one of the things that I've thought of with other Caribbean women writers as well, or other Caribbean women writers have written about this, about the way that literature is an antidote to historical amnesia. So we have some clues that we have a diminished archive, and so there's some information that Inocencia had these clubs and kept notes, but we don't have all of the records. And so I'm thinking in particular of someone like Maurice Condé, who was from Martinique, who wrote a novel titled I, Tituba, Black Witch of Salem. So one of the only black women that we know of who was burned at the stake for being a witch. And there's very little information about her, so Maurice Condé does this research, and Maurice Condé, a novelist from Martinique, does this research and writes a novel about her because she can't write a history about it because there's not enough information. So I think that's one of the things that stands out to me about these women, these early Puerto Rican women whose stories might not be able to be told if you wanted to write a history about them, but can certainly be imagined and come to life in interesting ways. So I think that the genre is really important. I think that that the use of the role of literature in these these intersections of literature and history, I think are really interesting and important.
They're very difficult.
Yeah, and that's my paper. I have to say that I was thinking about that as I was reading the two of them. Like, I could write a paper on these two novels together, or a review, or something like that. So, yeah.
Well, I have to tell you something interesting about that, because I never set out to write a novel.
Okay.
I am a historian. That's what I do. But a number of years ago, when we put together the encyclopedia, we have a 3-volume encyclopedia of Latinas in the United States that was very well received. And so we have about, 500 women, 500 stories in it. We have them in the Centro library if you're interested, or in local libraries. It's all over. There was one woman that I couldn't get her. I got 500 entries, and this one woman kept appearing to me. I'd dream about her. I'd think about her. I had never come across her before. I didn't write her entry either. Somebody else had written it, and I started to think about her life because it would be the beginning of the 3. I imagine a trilogy, if I live that long. A trilogy to put these 3 books together, and I decided that I was going to write her story. I had 200 letters that she had written, and I did all the research, and I had all of the information. It wouldn't come. I couldn't write it as a history. There was something missing. What was missing was the fact that we tend to write women into history in the barest way Emilia Casanova de Villaverde, la amante de la bandera. Please, you know. The same thing with Inocencia, the first woman to create the, you know. But I knew that they had a life, and I knew that they had a life in New York, in the places that I knew about. And so I ended up writing that novel on her, with the idea that I would introduce Inocencia and then carry the Puerto Rican book, you know, would then be written. It wasn't like, you know, my brother tells me your books are never going to be bestsellers. Okay, that's fine, as long as my brother, my brother, but he reads them. So I said, really? Well, I want you to know, you know, this book is doing really well. And what happened as a result of that book, and you know the story, is that after the book was out about 4 years, her descendants got in touch with me. Now I'm saying, wait a minute, I'm writing a book about a 19th century woman. She's not supposed to have descendants. What am I doing wrong? Am I going to get sued over something that I said about her? Well, the descendants got 2 of them who didn't know each other. And because of the book, the entire family has now come together. They traced their family history back to the 1100s in Spain. They are the ones that facilitated for me the pictures of the Casanova family, which I would have never gotten. They are. They found the 3rd member of the family. There were 3 brothers originally. Each of these women is a daughter of one of the brothers. And the entire family has reunited based on the book. You never know why things happen.
And I have Casanova in my family tree.
There you go. There you go. You may be a relative too. You may be a relative. So I with Inocencia it's different, because with Inocencia there just isn't enough historical information. And so you've got to, although her biographer wrote, Inocencia Martínez Santaella, de inocencia no tenía nada, y de santa menos.
Very nice.
Her biographer is Josefina Toledo, a Cuban historian who lives in Havana.
Oh, I know who she is.
Yeah, you know who she is? Yeah. She's great. She's really great. So that's why you end up writing a novel sometimes instead of, because it does allow you to tell the truth in human terms, which you don't always do in history.
It's true.
Yeah.
Yes.
How were you able to, because even the family didn't know.
Nada.
Right? So how were you able to research and get the information needed?
Do you know the honest truth to that? My mother passed away in 92, and years later I realized I created Anna, a strong, loyal, just a very strong woman who would, I think I conjured her up because I needed my mom. So I did research midwifery, Cuba during that time period, all the practices, all the laws. Like I said, I read all the theory, but I created her from my heart because I needed her.
Thank you.
Thank you for asking.
Other questions?
I have a comment.
Yeah.
I think that making it into a novel is a very positive thing, because I'm in communications, and I think your knowledge should be shared with the public. It's not good enough for you to know, and for studies and universities to know. The public in general must know what your legacy is, what your history is, what you're about, how you evolved, how in New York you had Puerto Ricans, Cubans, and Dominicans working together. instead of being separated by whatever. But if you tell someone, I have a great history book for you,
It's true. The eyes rolled over.
if you tell them, I have a juicy novela, oh, you're gonna love this novel. They'll say, yeah, really? Hey, what is it about? And they'll look for it. So you have to present this. Your knowledge, your experience has to be channeled in a way where you will reach the masses. Otherwise, it's a very limited audience, unfortunately.
Can be.
And also, people in communications don't want to interview you if it's a history book. They'll put you in PBS, or they'll put you in Sunday morning show, and they'll do a little something, a little 5-minute interview. But if everybody's talking about your novel, and the people in the novel, what happened, there's an interest. So you're a good topic, so they'll interview you. And the housewives and the kids will learn your message. Otherwise, it'll fade away. That's it.
Yes, there's something about the popular form of,
Right.
of literature that
And I think
lends
they're on the right
itself.
track. And it's never too late. You may say, tarde la vida. No,
No, never.
never.
Mm-mm.
We have another question? A couple of questions, actually.
Good.
Yeah. Go ahead.
Thank you.
Yeah.
How far do you feel you can kind of smudge over those lines of historicity, if I can put it that way? Feel about that?
Well, I know for myself, there are two different types of writers. There are two different types of painters. Creating, you're either a planner or you're a pantser. That means you go by the seat of your pants, basically. So they're two different, and you can be both. It depends on the novel. With the first novel, I didn't know what I was doing. I didn't know I couldn't write a novel. I thought, well, of course I'm going to write a novel. But then I learned the rules later. Now that I've learned all the rules, now I'm kind of a little bit more organized, but I won't let it stifle my creativity, because that comes first. So to me, in a perfect world, a perfect novel, historical novel, is seamless, where you're learning something and you didn't even know it. That's how I learned French. I said to my teacher, if you give me grammar, I'm going to throw you out. If you make it fun, I'm going to learn French. So I think to me, I like it to be seamless, where and you may research for hours and not use half of it, but you need to know it.
You need to know it.
You need to know it.
Yeah.
You can't use everything, because that would just be, I hate to say vomit, but that's what they say in these writer conferences. You can't just regurgitate what you know.
But you have to know
But you
it.
have to know it.
It's like when you're acting on stage. You have a character. The character is there. It's written for you. But to make that character believable, you have to know everything about that character. You've got to create that. You've got to create that background. The enormous amount of research that goes into it, it has to be. If it's not seamless, then you're not doing the job. You know, if you, because that has to become a part. Look at
You
your
have to
example. Look, the
know.
example I was talking about before about how you make the starch. Well, these women are not showing you. She's not writing about how you make starch. This is an occurrence in the life of the women at a particular time when they are doing this, and it just blends in. If you didn't know that, you didn't know the specifics of it, you wouldn't be able to bring it in so easily.
Can I add
Yeah.
something else? I was going to say to that. Before I write a novel, with this one I did the same thing. I have biographies of each of my characters. I know who they are, where they were born, what they like, what they don't like, what they're fearful of, what their strengths are, what their vulnerabilities are. What would they do if something happened? I have to know each character intimately to know how they're going to react when I put them in a situation. That said, even though I know everything there is to know about, let's say right now I have, in my new book, I have 2 women and 3 men. I've never written in a male voice. The male in this didn't really have a voice, but he was there. Now, they may want to do something totally different.
Mhm.
You know, I can plan till the cows come home, but the characters lead the story sometimes.
Yeah.
And they may say, no, I'm not going to do that. I'm going to throw a wrench in this, or I'm going to do something totally different. So so I go with the flow. I don't stick to an outline ever. It's organizational for my head. I want the structure, but I can't be limited by it, because then where's your creativity? So it's a very delicate balance between the facts, creation, and imagination.
And that's the fun of it.
And it is a fun.
That is the
yeah.
fun.
And you have to love research
Yeah.
if you're doing historical fiction.
Yeah.
Just clarify, that seamlessness, as you put it, that's the balance. That it's seamless.
That's the goal. I love a perfect sentence. I can work on one sentence for like a week.
Mm-hmm.
So you have to have a little kind of Virgo traits in you too. It's kind of masochistic.
But I would say that they
True.
both are. I mean, I
We're
think both of
Vir-
them are.
We are Virgos.
Are you?
Are you a
Virgos?
Virgo?
I am too.
No.
But
Oh my
I would
God, my hair
say-
stood up.
I would say
Oh,
that's not what
wow.
I was going to say. Actually, I was going to say
That's
that
shocking.
they
shocking.
are quite seamless. I would.
No, it's
I
not.
mean, in what I
It's
know from the
amazing.
from the
I'm stunned.
historical periods of both
Yeah.
the settings of both books, both novels, and the way that the story, those facts are woven into the story, it is very seamless. It never felt, as I was reading, it never felt to me like I'm now being given a lecture or a lesson
Right.
on a historical period. The history is really woven into the characters in a beautiful way. So I encourage everyone to buy these books. We had one more question. I'm not sure when. Should we stop at 7:30?
Yeah,
Is that when we
7:30.
should? Oh, I want to take this one question
Yeah.
No, I think
Just
we have
leave
more
some
time.
for people.
for the reception and to
Okay.
talk. Okay.
Okay.
Yes, please.
It's not so much a question as a statement. I would have the pleasure of reading your book. I got it from Dr. Raquel Ortiz, and I'm working with her at the high school that I'm in, and we're doing the chronology of the Puerto Rican struggles, right, from Puerto Rico to here, and my students are hungry.
Yeah,
Hungry
for that information.
I'm one of those angry Latinas in the public school system, and this is a book that we can read in school. We can read
Yeah.
in class,
Right.
as opposed to reading
Right.
Catch and the Rye, and
Exactly.
stuff like that. You know,
Exactly.
and, you know,
Amen.
we need this. So I thank you. I thank
Yeah.
you because we're doing the history of
Yeah.
Puerto Ricans, Dominicans, Mexicans, African American, and what we all have in common, what's going on here with all those groups. And then this book, when I started, I'm like, oh my God, they were working with the same people. And we did Edito de Lares, and my kids are like, oh my God, this is what was going on back then. And I didn't know that Cuba was. So when they're reading this book, and I'm
Yeah.
reading it, so now I'm gonna go to my principal and say, you know, we need to get this book for the English department.
Yeah. You know, you can, well, Raquel must have told you. Raquel paid her to say this.
I saw this, I came
Yeah.
today because I saw it this morning.
Yeah.
I'm like, I gotta get there.
Yeah,
I just
yeah.
finished a game. I said, I gotta get to this book
Yeah.
signing because of this, you know, I need to get here just so that you can know that I thank you.
Yeah.
This is so
Thank you, thank you. You know, you can get Behind the Book, which is an organization in New York City to encourage reading in the lower grades, from K to 12. And if a teacher requests a book for her class, they will provide the books for the students and bring the author to speak to the class. It's Behind the Book. Check it out. I didn't know anything about it, but both Raquel and I have done this. I did it with my little children's book, Teresita. But I also want to say something about a reason for writing the book, which is very, she's a real writer, you know. She's a creative writer. I have an agenda. And my agenda is to get this material into the hands of our kids because they need it.
Well, we have the same agenda.
You know, in the school system, in the public school system in New York, there is no place for our story. Even though there are 5 million of us in the United States, there is no place for our story. If you look at the social studies curriculum, which I worked on for years with the state, to try to get in one little bit of information, it was a struggle. So by the time they get into college and they want to find out, or they come through the ambassador, the cultural ambassadors program, and they find out their history, that's too late. And you need to reach them when they're interested. And right now, they're reading all kinds of great books about growing up in Brooklyn and shadow shapers
Shape-shifting.
and all of this exciting, fast-moving stuff. But you also have to make room for the historical stuff because that's where they see themselves. And once they see themselves in the curriculum, and they know that there's a sense of ownership in terms of locale, in terms of region. So yeah, encourage them to use the books, and Eleanor's book also. When you read it, you'll see. Yeah, yeah.
We have one last question. Yes, please.
Well, before I get to my question, just to let her know that there are some books right now, especially to your point, at the early ages.
Mhm.
I have some music teachers who told me they've been dealing with their music students in elementary school. There's a book on Celia Cruz.
Yeah.
There's a book
Yes.
on Cortijo.
Yeah.
There's a book on, so these people
Right.
are people they
Right.
can relate to.
Yeah.
And it makes a world of
It
difference, especially
makes-
at that age.
Yeah.
So my
Sure.
question to both of you is in terms of process.
Mhm.
When, just in general, when you have the concept and the idea, and you start to work, and you sit down to do the work, the writing, when you sit to do the writing, which is the hardest part, how long does it take you? And when you sit to do the writing, is your process, do you wake up in the morning? Do you have a ritual? Do you do exercise? Do you write for 4 hours and stop?
It's a good question.
It is a
That's
good
what I'd like
question.
to know.
Yeah.
What's the
It is.
Very
process?
practical.
It is.
Yes.
It is.
God.
Well, you dream of it, first of all, when you're working on something. You all do. We all do that.
Dream
When
what?
you dream the story. You dream what has to happen. You dream. I remember one night that I had a rough time in trying to put the. I have the history, so I know where I want to go. What I have to do is find out how they felt, how they acted, how they lived, what made them human. Why do I relate to them? Not just a name and a figure, the woman who loved the flag type of stuff. But once you're in the process, I had a really hard time with Emilia because it was the first book that I was trying to write. And one night she came. She said, "You're doing this wrong. What you have to do is," and of course I had it in my head all the time. I just didn't know it. But in terms of process, sometimes that's just, it's consuming. It takes over your life. And then that's all you talk about, and no one ever invites you to their house. So not that one again. And my brother will say, it's not going to be a bestseller.
Nice.
So, yeah.
My process would.
When you sit down to actually
Oh,
write,
go ahead.
you spend a whole day, or 8 hours, 10 hours?
Until my husband tells me, "Are you making dinner today?" Or, it's not good for your health to sit all day at a computer.
But I want to add one
Yeah.
thing to this, that when I was new faculty here at CUNY, Virginia was my mentor in a
nice.
writing program for junior faculty. And I was trying to figure out how to get my writing done. And she said, look at your calendar for the week, block off hours. That's when you're going to write. Don't tell anybody what you're doing at that time. And if anybody asks, are you available, and it happens to be one of your writing blocks, say no, and don't tell them why. And that was very, very good advice.
You did it? And you did
and
it
I did
because
it.
you wrote a
and
great
it's the
book.
only reason why I think I got my book, my writings done,
Yeah.
my publications
Yeah.
done. But that was the best advice. So I want to pass that on. She didn't
So-
share that, but she shared that with me many years ago, and it was very useful advice.
I write best from 9 p.m. till whenever. That's
what
when the
people
world
do.
is quiet.
You're the night owl.
I'm a night owl. I'm still single, so just if you're looking to get married and have a nice relationship, do not choose writing books because it is an obsession. It's true.
It is. It
I
becomes-
can say no at the drop of a hat because I have to do it.
And
I
it
have
doesn't
to
matter,
do
it
it.
doesn't matter that you're not doing it because for any outside reason. You have an agenda. You have a
Right,
personal.
yeah.
You have a personal reason for getting this particular book written. That doesn't matter. You just do it. You have to do it, unless you're writing a dissertation. When you're writing a dissertation, sometimes you don't want to write it, but and that's when you really have to stick to okay, I've got to do this
But you
because
get-
it's a
you get
question
your-
of discipline.
But you have to
So-
get you have to have a life as well. So in the morning, because if you write full time, it's a business. So I do my emails in the morning. So I get all the minutia out of the way, and I meditate. I get everything ready, and then it's done. But because I live alone, I don't have many distractions. My children are grown. They're raised. They're doing great. Thank God. So I don't have the distractions. So I have the luxury of writing anytime I feel like it. And I take full advantage of that. Yeah, you don't write to make money.
No.
But you write because
Absolutely
you
not.
love it and you have a story to tell. And it is a teaching. It doesn't matter if you're an historian or literary, your genre could be literary fiction, fantasy, you still have a message. But I couldn't imagine doing anything else.
Well,
Yeah.
I know we don't want to finish. We keep going and going and going. And so I appreciate that. It's been a treat, a real pleasure to have the panelists here. I'm not a literature person. I really enjoyed the conversation. I just want to say 2 words before we close this part of the program, which are that, or the point is that the Cultural Ambassador program has been mentioned. I just want to say 2 words about that. We don't have the teaching of Puerto Rican history or culture anywhere, any district, in any part of the United States.
Really?
So we have to figure out a different way of doing this, different
College.
way
When you
of
get to
doing this.
college,
We
you
have
have
curriculum. We have courses by
students there
Virginia,
for the
we
first
have
time.
Puerto Rican in the U.S. We have courses by Vanessa on the
That's
culture
scary.
of Puerto Ricans in New York City. We have another course by Teresita Levy on the history of Puerto Rico. And we're developing 8-10 more courses that are going to be online pretty soon. We're going to have sort of a Blackboard-like platform that people can come. We already have these courses online. You can go there and test your Puerto Rican knowledge. And I guarantee you, I thought I did know this stuff. And I passed barely with 70. And this is when I tried. So there's a lot of work to be done. It was formative. Raquel developed the questions and the quizzes. So we have a long way to go. For example, tonight could be very well converted into a piece to teach high school students. Raquel is working on elementary school models, right? And it's all about teaching teachers, teaching parents to use these materials to convey to their children. And we have a long way to go. So any one of you who would like to be part of that effort, there's plenty to do in curriculum development, in reaching out to teachers, in training teachers. We have that in doing what we call boot camps, where we bring people the whole day to do this. So it's plenty to work to do. Literature is a great way to get to your heritage and to get to know yourself, your culture and your heritage and so forth. So I'll encourage you all to do this. And how do we convert all this material into curriculum, train teachers so that they can use it in the classroom? So we need to create, this is a virtual district that we're creating online. And we need to do more of that. So to the authors, help us do that. To the audience, think about how you can do this. Take the quiz. I challenge you. And having said all that, it's been a real pleasure to have you here. It's a real treat. We don't know enough of this. We know plenty of authors, right? And they're very topics. But Bishop has been a little bit behind, so we need to do a bit more of that. So I thank you for that. We still have a little time before they kick us out, so please enjoy the rest of the evening. And thank you so much
Thank
for
you. Thank you.
We got
So there are refreshments in the back.
Oh, see, I wasn't
And
sure.
I think